Good evening, everyone. So very, very good to be with you tonight and studying in the book of 1 Timothy chapter 3. So I'd like to invite you to get a Bible out. We're going to be taking a look. 1 Timothy chapter 3, we're going to be talking about the work of overseers, the work of elders, and how it is that they are called by qualifications that are given in the Word of God. So as we kind of examine these things, as we look at these things, one of the things we're kind of considering too is how these are qualifications that really all of us are called in some way to fulfill. That, in other words, these are oftentimes expressions or terms that everyone who is in Christ is pursuing. Sober-mindedness, maturity, all the different things we describe. What we hope to see is that these are things that we're all striving for and trying to do. So we are in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Let me grab for just a moment some of our reference stuff and material there. There was a handout emailed out to you. If you don't have it, right now that handout is on our website, but it's in an odd place. It's under our FAQ. So if you go to our website, you go to our FAQ, it talks about how the church is organized. The handout on elders that I've been sending everyone is actually part of that FAQ. So hopefully you can find it there. But we're in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Let me grab the passage real quick that we've been reading from. We have been in the first few verses now, haven't gotten very far. But we're reading now from the New King James Version, which says the following. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the children of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall in the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. One of the things you might notice as you look at this list and consider these things is that if you're reading from a different translation, sometimes it'll render these words differently. These are very specific terms that sometimes the nuance of the term passes between more than one word. I'll try to bring up between the New King James and the New American Standard, but if you've got another translation that uses another word, I'd love to hear it. You have the English Standard Version or something else, just drop it in the chat. Let us know if there's a different word here, because I think the more words we have, the more full our understanding of these things is going to be. And last time we were talking about these qualifications, we had come to the point where we were looking at the first of the qualifications, that an elder, let me just remind you, elder, pastor, shepherd, overseer, bishop, they all mean the same thing. We use those words interchangeably. That the elder, the bishop, is to be a man. That it is the work of the church that's filled by a man. And we already talked about the idea of how that contrasts nicely with the statements made in 1 Timothy chapter 2. We also talked, by the way, a little bit about the necessity that it is a plurality of men that fulfill that office. Just like in verse 8, we're going to talk about deacons, and we'll mention the same point there, that it's a plurality of men that are fulfilling those offices. Stan makes the comment, he says, if a man seeketh, this man has a strong desire to help others. He's made changes to his life, that he will be able to do all that God has asked him to do. He is seeking glory for God. So it's a good point. In fact, Stan, I kind of suspect you're kind of thinking even there of our second qualification when it talks about the idea of desiring. So Stan, I appreciate you gave us the King James rendering there to seek after that position. Tell you what, I'm going to open my second Bible chat so I can grab these things. In the New American Standard, it talks about the word aspire, desire, aspire, seek. What kind of things are we getting here? I'm going to throw out the Greek words here. There's a lot of times I'm not a big fan of throwing out too many Greek words, only because I feel like translators typically do a far better job than I do of finding the right application. I think it's a little dangerous sometimes for somebody to look at a word and say, well, it could mean something else, and chase down a rabbit trail when usually the best words are the words that are being used. Another conversation for another day, but typically I'm not one to go too far into Greek word studies, but for the sake of our understanding, I thought it might be worth it this one time to do so. So I want us to think about the idea of desiring the work. I want to consider or ask the question, which way is he desiring this work? In other words, does he desire it for himself, or does he desire it for the church? It's kind of an interesting thing. And by the way, you might not see the qualifications beginning until verse 2, and I think that's okay too. That in other words, verse 2 begins a list of characteristics, and verse 1 is merely describing the pursuit of that. So Stan has a comment for us. Stan says the word implies eagerness, but not of an immoderate or unchristian character, a desire so strong that he in whom it exists can be satisfied in no other calling. So Stan describes here the great desire somebody might have. Maybe I ask a question to kind of, bring out some different thoughts on this. If you knew somebody who said, and I've met people similar to this, I want to be in charge. I really want to be the person that's the overseer of the church. I really want to be the one that shepherds the church. That's the one that directs the affairs of everything. Sometimes, how does that feeling grab you of somebody who describes their desire in that way? Rob makes this statement. Rob says, it's much the same as a shepherd over his flock. Now, Rob, I kind of think that's a great point. I think one has to say to themselves, why does somebody pursue the idea of being a shepherd? In a literal sense, what's their desire in being a shepherd, or doing the work of a shepherd even more so? See, that might even fit better, Rob, describing it that way. Teresa says it like this. She says, well, not for himself, prestige or self-seeking, but to fulfill God's desire for us to have leaders. See, and I think that that's a great way of putting it, Teresa, and I think it's kind of an important distinction. Stephen Root says maybe overbearing, perhaps. Intention is the key. Stephen, I think that's it. I think that's right. Stan says wrong. It should be the attitude of service. And Gregory says wanting to rule, wanting to be king or be lauded versus serving. So I think you guys all kind of get the idea here. What does it mean to desire the work? It's not about the idea of desiring the work itself. In part because maybe the work itself, it's tough. It's a hard work. It's and the idea is if somebody wants that position of power, we're a little wary of that. But when somebody wants that position, in other words, they want that position to be there, they want that work to be accomplished. I kind of go back to what Rob said about the sheep and the shepherd. The shepherd is there because he wants the sheep to be safe. His desire is that the sheep are going to be fed. His desire is for the sheep. It's not for himself. It's not that he wants to be the shepherd. He wants someone to take care of the sheep, and he wants to do that work. That's the sense here. Lamar says this. He says the desire to serve in the position must be with the full understanding of all that's required, which is described here and in other places. It's a serving leadership role with accountability. Very good, Lamar. In fact, one of the words we are going to talk about is the idea of standing up it talks about a little bit of standing up before your family, but in Titus, but the idea of standing up before a group of people as though you're prepared to say, I want to set an example of what it is to be a servant. And I really like that point. Stan Malor, he says, he was ready to deny himself and undergo hardships by devoting himself to that service. He sought to be employed in a good work. So again, a good point for us to consider about these things. So when we consider this idea of that desire for the service or for the work here, as I said, one of the big ideas is we're saying this is the desire for the church. Not so much the idea that, hey, I want this, and again, office might not be the best word to describe it, but I want this work. I want this for me. That might not be what he's talking about here. To desire that work is desire that work is done. I was thinking of another usage of that same work of desiring. In 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 31, Paul was talking to the people in Corinth, and he says, you need to desire the best gifts. What's kind of interesting there he's saying all Christians need to desire. Now, in that moment, he's talking about spiritual gifts, but I think we could say abilities or things that we do. And so I would suggest to you that all Christians ought to desire things to do to serve the church. That 1 Corinthians 12:31 contrasts nicely with this passage here, and thinking about these things, that we all ought to desire to do things that would serve the church, to have abilities that would bless the church. In fact, I would say that Paul's one of Paul's criticisms of the brethren in Corinth is that they may desire spiritual gifts for the wrong reason. And his point is you need to desire these things for the betterment of the church, of your brethren. Teresa says the following. Teresa says they're taking on the responsibility of watching out for the souls of the congregation. It is a serious and difficult work at times. So that's an important point. I like the way in Hebrews he makes the statement that they are accountable for your soul, that's a pretty profound description. I think about this a lot. You think about the idea that if somebody has fallen away from the church, that person, the overseers of the church, will need to give an account for. Now, by the way, I would say also, so will the members of the church. Indeed, I want to understand, but I debated how far we might venture into this subject, but imagine for a moment a church that doesn't have elders, which, by the way, that's actually more common than having elders. You may or may not know that even in the New Testament times, the churches there were more likely not to have them, as we meet those churches, than had them. But the point is that a lot of this oversight, then that oversight is still necessary to a degree, so it falls to the members. And so we're actually all accountable to one another. Every person who has fallen away from our congregation, as I think about standing before God and God asks me, why did that person go? What did you do to save them? Could you have, did they leave because of you? There's a lot of questions that'll have to be answered. But I would suggest all of us need to think about how we would answer those questions. This is important for us to think about. Desire for the work. As we saw here, this idea of the desire is a key part of the things that we're looking at. Stephen Root says it nicely. He says, we are to be each other's support system. Great point. We're supposed to be able to depend on each other, to lean on each other. And Stephen, what's really important here is that, again, if we're not there, and I want to be careful to say, that fundamentally that might be the most basic way we do it, is just to be there for each other. That if we're not offering that, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. I mean, that's going to be something that we're going to get pointed to on the day of judgments. So this is an important point for us to consider. Stan's got a comment here, but it looks like only half of it came up, so I'll wait for the other half before we bring it in. Meanwhile, we'll go ahead and go on to the next qualification there, which, as I said, you might see as the first qualification, depending where you see that list beginning, because this is what's found in verse 2. And in verse 2, it says, a bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. Let me just kind of step back for a second, because Linda brought up a real good comment. She took us over to Romans 12:1. Love that verse, Linda, about being a living sacrifice. And she says, excuse me, this is a way that we fulfill Romans 12:1, to be a living sacrifice. And so, the idea, Linda, I think, is, again, that desire ought to be a desire to serve, a desire, not necessarily a desire to say, this is what I want, but I want to serve. I want to help. I want to give. That's the desire that these works fulfill. And by the way, therefore, that becomes the desire of any office, right? If I'm going to lead singing, if I'm going to lead a prayer, if I'm going to clean the building, if I'm, if I'm just the person that people call to work on their car, or I'm the person that they call to carry big boxes, well, I ought to have a desire to do it. That to be qualified for that work, I would have a desire to do it. That might be the first thing in so many different works. I just think it's really important, like you say there, Linda, that Romans 12:1, the living sacrifice, is a great draw for all of us. Stan's got his comment up. He says, I have been in congregations where the elders have asked every member to talk to the fallen brethren before action is taken. I think that is a fantastic idea. A lot of times we just kind of generally encourage everyone to get in contact, and I don't know if everybody does or not. I'm not really sure how many of us actually do reach out to somebody. But, Stan, I would say that on the day of judgment, if I've at least reached out and tried, that I'll probably pass that test a lot better than if I have to stand before God and said, I didn't do a thing when that brother fell away or that sister fell away. That's serious. That's a big deal. And Stan, that's a good observation for us to consider. What does it mean to be blameless? It's interesting that the idea of blameless comes from a terminology that talks about the idea of not having been arrested, like by the police or something like that. The idea of being blameless, to be above reproach on the New American Standard. It's somebody who's inculpable. There's nothing that you'd say, well, this is his fault. His fault is well, and like I said, we're really talking spiritual faults, of course, not that he's, not very good at fixing cars. He's covetous. He's lustful. He's, vengeful. He's angry. These are accusations, spiritual conditions that a person is not to be in. And if those accusations can be made, then we would say that person's not qualified. That if that accusation can be made, and I'm going to be careful to say to be substantiated, if somebody says, that's their circumstance, that's who they are, they can't control their mouth, they don't control their words, then this qualification speaks to the characteristic there that's not been found. So it's important for us to understand this idea of what it means to be blameless. Now, by the way, again, this is another one of those statements that's found repeatedly in the New Testament. It tells us in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 7, just two chapters away from where we're at, that in being commanded to do the right things, we pursue the attitude of being blameless. He uses the same word there for all of us. So that's an important point. So it's important to understand this concept of being blameless. We're all pursuing being blameless. I hope we would understand that if I can't say I pursue being blameless, then I'm going to have a great deal of danger on the day of judgment. I would hope that all of us would probably understand that idea of what that means, that I am desperately or constantly seeking after the idea of putting aside all of my faults, of changing myself, of being somebody that whenever you try to make the accusation, you're not going to find it. So it's a good point for us to consider. I don't see a lot of comments on that. Makes sense, by the way. I think blameless more or less stands pretty clearly to be understood. But the next one is one I think probably a lot of us will have comments on. And they're kind of tough because this one, a lot of times we find ourselves kind of entering into a lot of maybe opinions and such, and we almost have to kind of come up with a conclusion about this. Actually, let me step back for just a moment because Lamar had one more comment for us. Lamar says, blameless is elaborated on for the remaining verses. That's a good point, Lamar. Hadn't really thought about this. That's really interesting. Interesting way of putting that, Lamar. It is kind of a conversation about the remaining verses, isn't it? Stan's comment is interesting, and Stan, what you're saying is interesting because it kind of applies back to one of the last statements that's going to be made. In verse 7, it says, moreover, he has to have a good testimony among those who are outside. Stan says, I've seen it when elders are considered, a man is considered as an elder. The members who went to the place of employment of the man and talked with those he worked with, also his neighbors. The Bible says you're supposed to have a good reputation with outsiders. Stan, I would wonder, how could we know somebody's reputation with outsiders without having a sense of that? It's kind of a tricky one, Stan. It's kind of an interesting observation you make, and maybe the due diligence of the congregation, maybe we would say it pays off whenever we're saying, hey, we're going to look into, what do your neighbors say about you? What are the, people you work with say about you? Those are all worthy or worth the time to consider how we might pursue the idea of blameless. Husband of one wife. The Greek word literally means a one-woman man, and in all honesty, it's kind of a broad term. The term itself, and this is one of those times where the language itself isn't going to help us as much as the context of the conversation, or in a broader sense, the context of being a Christian is probably where we're going to find our answer. Because just being a one-woman man could mean a lot of things. I remember once hearing somebody say, well, in a time of polygamy, this was just trying to say that the elder had to be somebody who only had one wife versus somebody who had lots of wives. So I've heard somebody look at it from that scenario. Maybe, somebody says, well, it's describing the idea of being scripturally married. Not just the idea that you do have one wife, but you have the one wife you're supposed to have. We understand that, there's a concept of a authorized scriptural marriage, a marriage that God has ordained. And then there's the idea of a marriage that isn't, right by God. Jesus would say some of those marriages are called adulterous marriages. So that's a point too. And then some of times we'd look at this and we'd say, well, the husband of one wife implies the idea that he's had no other wives. So he's only been married once. Now, as I said, at first, the very language of the term really doesn't lend itself to any one idea above another. Necessarily, but we might find if we went over to 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 2, something similar there. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 2, as we talk about this passage, there's a statement there made about widows who are being put on the roll for the aid to the church. And in verse 9, let me pull that passage up for you to see. And in verse 9 it says, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man." Now, what's interesting here is this is a contrasting passage to these things. In this case, chapter 5 is talking about, the idea that circumstantially that this is somebody who is going to be aided by the church. And like I said, using a very similar term here to describe this, well, there's a couple of things we might contextually then be able to take out. For one thing, as we kind of think of this idea, and I think Stan's agreeing with me, and that's a lesson to all of you that listen, agree with Brian. Just kidding. But Stan takes us over to the same place to kind of describe this terminology used here. But what's interesting is it uses this term for somebody who at that moment's spouse is dead. So one thing we might say is that what this passage then, and let me kind of jump back and get back to let me just move to here for a moment. When he talks about the idea of having a one-woman man, it's not the idea of saying, well, this is a person, who's not, married now. The idea is that they have had one spouse. And I think we might get a sense here from that 1 Timothy chapter 5 passage that what we're describing here is someone who was married only once. I think, like I said, 1 Timothy 5, that's probably what we think that passage would mean. One of the nice things about the concept, if I say, well, married only once, I'm not sure. Well, you could say, though, that married only once fits all three. It means you possess a wife. It means you're scripturally married. And, married only once, you could say it actually covers all the bases. At the same time, it doesn't really leave anything that there's a possibility of a misunderstanding. So, and I'm always one, I don't like to always say, well, better safe than sorry. I don't think that's a good hermeneutic. But I will say that this married only once does seem to be the most appropriately fitting concept for what it is that we're talking about in this conversation. That again, using the context of other passages, trying to understand these things better, married only once seems to be a very nicely fitting point. If you got another thought, you want to put another thought out there, this is a good place to do it. This is a good time to do it. You can always, by the way, you can always contact me privately too. You say, hey, Brian, I've wondered about this, or I see something different here, but you don't want to make it too public. I'd love to hear from you. So, I'm always glad to hear somebody's view and to think about different ways of thinking of things. But like I said, if somebody has something they can go on. So Teresa has a good question. She says, well, if a man can only be married once, can he continue to be an elder if his wife dies? Now, Teresa, that's a really good question. And one thing to think of is the idea that the idea is here that are you still qualified? Well, one thing is the work of an elder and the work of a deacon is a work that a man and a woman are doing, that there has to be a woman that's qualified as well. Now, we saw that for sure with deacons. We mentioned last week that it seems that it's the case with elders because of the likewise statement that we see in verse 8. So what we want to kind of understand is that without a wife who is also qualified in these same ventures, that a man isn't qualified to be an elder. So we typically would say, no, if a man dies, he's no longer fit to be an elder because he doesn't have that component that qualifies him to that work. Now, it's kind of interesting. Anthony takes us back to that same passage, 1 Timothy 5:9. You're a widower. You're no longer eligible to be an elder because you're no longer married. And again, the idea is that, it fits the idea that you possess a wife, you're scripturally married, you're married only once. All of those bases being covered by this understanding of things kind of makes it understood that, yeah, if the wife dies, you can't do it. I actually, Teresa, it's one of those times. I'm going to be real careful here, Teresa, because this is also not good hermeneutic, but I can kind of see why it makes sense. Again, in the sense that, to do a lot of works, without, you didn't have a wife to participate in that work, to advise or to give some sense to things, to offer a partnership in that work. I can see the wisdom of why God says this is a one work that two people need to be qualified in order to perform. I can kind of see God's wisdom in that. That's not what we're talking about. We talk about Bible authority. I want to be really clear about that, but I can see some sense to why that would be the case and why the present tense is not only the most likely, the best fitting of these circumstances, but it also is the terminology that may seem the wisest as well. Does that make sense, Teresa? I hope it does. I hope it kind of answered or gave you some thought there. See another comment from Rob. Rob states the church is not responsible to take care of everyone financially. We as Christians have a responsibility in personal works to do these things. The church is for worshiping God and spreading the gospel. Rob, we're going to come back to that here in 1 Timothy chapter 5 as well, and some of the conversation there, and I kind of presume that's probably where a little bit of your thought process was going. We'll come back to that very important point to that end. So here's another statement. Lamar says, the husband of one wife combined with being blameless seems to imply the qualification is about his purity towards his wife as the only one for him. It's interesting, Lamar, and I kind of like that, draw into that, to draw that to, this behavior. And Lamar, what's kind of interesting is, what if you continue that thought and say the husband of one wife, demonstrating his prudence, his temperance, his respectability, his hospitality. You might find a lot of that kind of characteristic, going from both blameless and through these other things as well. So that's a really interesting point for us to consider too. Just really worthwhile thing for us to consider as well. So like I said, this is one that I think a lot of times there's a lot of difficulty to understand. As I said, one of the things is there's one way to understand this that causes no problems, as well tends to fit the context of other passages that sound the same. That is the idea of a man who's been married once and he is married and he's able to fulfill these things. And so that's, how it's most often approached. I'm sure probably everybody here would say, well, I know of a church where probably so. And that's one of those conversations where if I were a member of the church, maybe I'd have something to say about it. But not being a member, I might not. So that's kind of an important idea that I, kind of leave sometimes to the distinction of that congregation. Anthony goes on to say, well, we could continue Teresa's question in other areas. If he starts drinking, if he becomes contentious, if one of his children falls away, if he's still qualified. So, it's kind of an interesting point, Anthony, to say, do these qualifications cover once you meet it, you're qualified, indefinitely, you're once appointed, always appointed? I just invented a new idea there. Once appointed, always appointed, or is it the idea that once we cease these qualifications, we are no longer qualified? So that's a good point. And what's interesting about that, Anthony, is that if there was an issue where, a man was married and his wife died and that still qualified him, it would be an exception to the rest of those rules, wouldn't it? So that's a good point, Anthony, that you bring out there. That if it were permissible, it would stand as an exception to the rest of these rules that are being given for that commendation. So I really appreciate that. Really appreciate that comment. Anybody else has any thoughts or anything else to draw out there? That's you can keep them up, keep them going. Like I said, and also like I said, if you're kind of a little nervous about asking something, shoot me an email. I'd be glad to hear it. This is an area that get us in trouble. Lamar makes the statement saying, well, Anthony's examples disqualify me no longer be blameless as well. So you might see that sense there too. That's good. Teresa says those are sins. Anthony points out a wife dying isn't. And she's just saying, not trying to be contentious, just not certain of this passage about one wife. And Teresa, I agree with you. This actually is one that, as I said, the words itself lend itself to a couple of different directions. And as I keep saying, I think there is a path on this that is probably the easiest one to reconcile and to make sense of. But again, you're right. It isn't exactly an easy one to understand exactly. But again, also, like I said, we would want to say that there's a contextual concept here of several different things that we're trying to bring together and to put together behavior. And by the way, there are things that come up that draw from the past. When we talk about how his household has been in order, we're not going to mention it here, but in Titus 1, when it talks about the faith of his children, these are all things that began in the past and are present even now. So, again, some of these things are constant and moving but they had a beginning point, and there's something that you can point to like that as well. So very, very good. And like I said, I didn't think it that contentious at all. I think it was a good question. As I said, I think a lot of churches have a lot of different views on this. This is not something that a lot of these other points. I'll be honest, though, one of the reasons we like to kind of sink in on this one is we kind of feel like it's easier than trying to say, well, what does it mean to be blameless? Or what does it mean not to be greedy for money? A lot of times those are statements that we interpret very subjectively as opposed to objectively. And we love objective qualifications because everybody can have an opinion and say this is what it is or this is what it is not. But like I said, I hope it makes sense to give an answer that says there is one way to look at this that, as I said, fills all the checks. It covers all these points, and we could have a great degree of confidence in one of these places. So that that's the path that oftentimes is pursued. That's an important point for us to consider. But as I said, you got more thoughts on it, just let me know. I'll be glad to hear from you. We can go ahead and pick up to the next one, but if there's more comments, we'll jump right back as we look at these things. The next one we see here is this terminology for temperate. It's kind of interesting. This is one of the, as it describes these things here, this is one term where it's used the same way in both the New King James and the King James, temperate. It's kind of interesting. You might remember back in the 19th century, in the 1800s, there were a lot of people that were involved in something called temperance movements. I tell you what, throw me out there if you remember what a temperance movement is. If you can tell us what that is, I'd love to hear it. A temperance movement. What was the temperance movement? It's related to these things. Here in this context, talking about temperate, what we would imply, especially moving away from the thing stated in verse 3 as being distinct or separate from this, we're talking about the idea of how it is to fulfill things with a certain attitude or emotional balance. Gregor pointed out, not 18th Amendment, no drinking. That was the temperance movement's result. Yeah, and Stan got it too. Not drinking. Sherry abstaining from alcohol. Temperance meant to abstain from alcohol. You didn't drink alcohol. So it's kind of interesting when we talk about temperate here, although we're not talking about alcohol. In verse 3 we will. Here we're talking about a certain kind of balanced behavior. Got a comment from Linda I want to jump back to real quick. I think Linda's kind of going back one before, so let's step back there for a moment. Linda says, men tend to remarry after their wife dies. That would certainly remove him from the office. Also, an unmarried man might not be suitable for some of the duties of an elder. And so Linda sees here, again, a concept of a certainty. And like I said, I would get that sometimes people say, I'm just not sure. That's fine. On the other hand, some of this sense of the unmarried man wouldn't be suitable for some of the duties. I think Linda and I are probably thinking of the same ideas of circumstances where, it would be best if a man and his wife were both part of a process of something. And again, I see the wisdom of God in establishing these things in that way. So it's a good comment to consider. Temperate, the balanced emotional self-control. Mind you that in Titus chapter 2, Titus would be told something similar in a passage that was just talking about all of the men of the church, or particularly the older men of the church. He says older men need to be, and he uses the word sober and temperate here, similar statements that are being made. And it's the idea of that balanced self-control, that idea of a person who has a control of themselves, who's able to, pulled up my passage in the wrong place, who's able to control themselves and to behave here, the emotional balance. And I guess in some ways for me, it's easier for me to say, it's easier for me to say what this looks like when it's not working. Someone who's not emotionally balanced or not emotionally under control. The person whose emotions are all over the place sometimes. And, like I said, it's not to say emotions are bad, but the idea of being unbalanced or not in control of yourself certainly is. Somebody has a good example of that. I'd love to hear it. If you think, well, this would fit that nicely, I'd sure like to hear what that might be if you have a thought that might fit that well. But that being said, like I said, the idea of being temperate is the idea of being somebody who's emotionally balanced. Oh, Lamar's got one. Thanks, Lamar. Lamar says, I've heard temperate here described as clear thinker, and the next word, sober-minded, as disciplined thinker with a focus on spiritual priorities. That's really neat. Because what Lamar is pointing out is that this term and the next term are really similar ideas. And I really appreciate Lamar's kind of helping us on the next one too, by saying, to look at these terms distinctly, the clear thinker, the next word, sober-minded, is disciplined thinker. That's interesting, Lamar. And I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of that before. That's a new one to me, that I hadn't considered that or heard that before. I know that when I was looking at these things, I was looking at the person who was not given to outbursts. I even would say to some degree, that the dangers of being overly opinionated or, sharing too many opinions. In fact, Lamar, that's kind of where I was going to go. But I really like what you had to say here. So this first person, you're a clear thinker, and again, that's the sobriety, that you're not, there's nothing that's damaging your thought process. And then the next one, he says, what about the disciplined thinker, the person who's, in control of their thoughts? That's a great way of looking at it. Teresa says this. She says, good decisions are usually not made when someone is not self-controlled or tends to be emotional and easily upset, angered, etc. That's what I kind of was thinking, Teresa. Anger is the one that comes to my mind. How many times it seems like our preacher is always saying that if you make decisions while you're angry, you're almost always going to make a bad decision. That's an important point in life, is that, what did James say? The anger of man doesn't accomplish the righteousness of God. There's a lot of things we get angry about, we, get upset about, but that anger, especially if that anger leads us to behavior or decisions, it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad. Not to say, being people of the flesh, we all get angry. But we have to keep that anger under control. We have to keep that anger subordinate to our understanding of the will of God. This is where it's really important to understand this idea, to keep it under the control of God. So that's something that we want to consider very carefully, to the idea of being temperate and the idea, let's jump to that next one, of being sober-minded as well. Here I got another one from Lisa. Lisa Root says, they can't make decisions based on their emotions. They have to put their thoughts and emotions aside to be able to make a sound decision for the church. That's exactly right, Lisa. You're speaking to the heart of what this qualification is all about. The ability to make decisions that aren't based on what I'm feeling, but what I know to be the best. And that's not always easy, right? And just in life, there's a lot of times where, our feelings are to do one thing or, to respond one way, and our understanding takes us a different direction. If especially anger or being upset with something, that you might want to say something, that's, hurtful or vengeful or something like that. And yet our understanding is that we have to keep those comments under control. When I consider the next term, as Lamar had brought up such a neat idea, the idea of being a critical or, being a directed thinker. I have to go back to what Lamar said, disciplined thinker, that was your term. I think it's neat. I like the idea too of considering how important it is to kind of manage your comments, your thoughts, your desires, your opinions. It's kind of a dangerous thing that when we don't have control of all of our, things that we're saying or our thought processes, that, that can be something that can create some troubles from time to time. So it's important that the people that do this work, that they have control of their opinions. I have to work hard on keeping my opinions under control because I'm like everybody else. We all have opinions. I would say, though, the number one problem with people and their opinions is we almost always overvalue our opinions, and we think other people need to hear them, and we don't appreciate the fact that oftentimes opinions have no value to anybody else. And that's a tough one to accept and learn in life. By the way, Stephen Root added to this. He says this lends itself to having a good reputation, and it does, right? That's a good point, Stephen. A good reputation with outsiders, being blameless. A lot of these kind of fall back to the idea that, when we say somebody is very opinionated, that's usually not a compliment, right? It's usually not saying that, they always have good advice for me or they're always, saying good things to me. Overly opinionated is usually a statement that implies the idea that maybe they say things that they ought not to say. It's tempting. It's really especially tempting when we're frustrated by the conduct of the world. But, even Jesus didn't share every thought he had. That's an important point for us to consider. So again, another good point, to be sober-minded, to be prudent, discreet. Again, this idea of self-controlled in our passions. It's so important. It's so very important. Lamar's got another comment. Boy, I'm choking a lot this afternoon. I think I dried out my throat. Lamar's comment is, since elders are watching for our spiritual souls, they should direct us towards spiritual priorities and being faithful to God in both their conduct and their words. And, it's interesting, Lamar, one of the ideas is the elder is supposed to be somebody that, the word that implies here that they stand up or they stand before people, that they're supposed to be somebody you look at and say, well, if I do that, I should be able to be okay. They should be creating a path that others can follow. That's what their life and their examples are meant to accomplish. So again, whether it's parenting, marriage, whether it's work, these are all things that hopefully they're giving examples of how we ought to behave and conduct ourselves. And that's an important point. Faithful that they direct us by their behavior should be something that we all pursue. I like that, Lamar. That's a real good point, real important point for us to consider. Let's go to the next one, shall we? And again, you got another comment. We'll jump back and come back to it. Whoops, I just lost it. So let's, I did not mean to do that. Let's actually jump over and grab ourselves over here now. The next one we're looking at is the idea of being of good behavior. So as it talks about these things, respectable, of good behavior, a degree of conduct. I'm going to have to change my Bible and grab where we want to be right here. Of good behavior. So let's talk about that for just a couple of moments. And the idea of being of good behavior, we would say, as I said, in some translations, the term there used is to be respectable, somebody whose behavior is appropriate. One kind of neat thing here is that the Greek word is the word cosmos. And you know that word, right? You think of cosmos, you think of the universe. Well, the term means something that's well ordered. Take that, atheists. That the very word for cosmos implies the idea that it has order. But whatever we want to say. Cosmos means it has good order, though. And the idea is when it talks about this idea of being orderly, it's talking about good behavior, modesty, characteristics that are the idea to say that if you have something, you do something, you behave in such a way with those things that are respectable, that are worthy of praise or attention to that. If if a person has a lot of money, they use that money wisely. If they have a skill to something, they use that skill wisely. That good behavior speaks to the idea of how it is I take things that I have and I put them to use. And it can apply to the home. It can apply to, our wealth. And in fact, you might even say, like hospitable, it applies to, you're using the things that you have in your home to serve others. Able to teach, you're using your abilities to serve others. It might fit nicely to some of those characteristics as well. I realize good behavior is really a pretty broad one, but let's be honest, a lot of times it kind of comes down to the crux of what feels right or seems right when somebody's put forward to be an elder. In other words, I've known circumstances where somebody said, well, this person's been put forward for an elder. We say, well, their wife, they got kids, their kids are Christians, but there's just something that's just not there. There's just something that just doesn't feel right. You've probably seen it in congregations where people said, I just don't really know that I want that person as the shepherd. What are you looking for? Well, sometimes what you're really looking for is the idea that somehow they're just not of a behavior that really reflects that this is what you want them to do. And I think sometimes it can fall into this concept of the right behavior, of the being respectable. Respectable is the idea that people want this. They want this service, or they want this product. They want this work. And so the idea here is that, if somebody's not desired by the congregation for that work, and I don't mean just by one or two people, I mean by a number of people in the congregation, you might be talking about something that fits into the concepts of the absence of good behavior. Well, I know we're a little bit past our time, and I appreciate you guys are always patient with me about that, but we'll go ahead and pause here. Picking up in the next one, hospitable, important lesson there to talk about. I've got a comment here from Linda I want to bring in. Linda says, James speaks to this in many ways: quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, bridle the whole body, controlling the tongue. Linda, I really haven't thought about it like that. But you're right. You've been reading the book of James quite a bit recently, haven't you? That the book of James really does speak to that, doesn't it? It really does kind of give us a sense of a lot of different ways that we look at the ideas of keeping ourselves in control. Linda, I really hadn't thought about it, but the book of James really is a nice contrast to all these characteristics. That's a really neat thought. Linda, I'm going to be dwelling on that one for a couple of days now. I really appreciate that. Teresa throws out one more thing. She says orderly is stable and solid, dependable. I'd like to spend more time on that being dependable, Teresa. That would have been interesting. Stan says we must be careful not to base our conditions on just my wants, and that's, probably a good thing for us to think about too. Well, we're stopping here. I want to thank everybody. Had some great comments. Good stuff to think about too. As I said, these aren't easy things to consider, how we understand these passages, but as we work through them, like I said, what we're hoping to see is that the Holy Spirit will call people to a certain work by these qualifications. We understand how important it is and how hard it is too, both to find people and to put people to this work. And how important it is that we're all striving for these characteristics. That comment about James really fits that nicely. So thanks again, all these great comments, great thoughts. Looking forward to our next study. We have our next study Wednesday night, 7 p.m. in the book of Numbers. What are we doing this Wednesday? It looks like we are talking about Korah's rebellion. So we'll be talking about that in the book of Numbers. Looking forward to that. And then next Sunday, we'll pick back up here in 1 Timothy 3. Thanks so much for some great comments. Everybody have a great weekend.